Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Hope you're enjoying your lunch. My name is Sean Coleman. We're gonna, begin this session as everyone gets seated. And so, thank you for spending your afternoon to have this important discussion on social equity program. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Sean Coleman. I'm president of 36 Solutions, a Colorado-based public affairs and consulting firm. I've been specializing in cannabis policy for a number of years. But like many of you who are in government and public officials, when I first came to cannabis policy, I myself was drinking out of a fire hose. I ended up with cannabis policy in my issues portfolio as a legislative assistant for, at the time, Congressman Jared Polis, who is now our state's governor. So I am very sympathetic to the idea that you learn a lot very quickly in a very fast-moving environment when it comes to this issue. So I appreciate the effort you're putting into that place. And with that in mind, this conversation about social equity is particularly important because it really makes us deal with some challenging issues in a way that we have to have honest conversations, right? And because the reality is that the war on cannabis negatively impacted certain communities, and those communities continue to be left out of the profits of the peace. And so it's a double insult, it's a double wound. And the good thing that comes from wounds is that wounds give you the opportunity to heal. Cannabis policy touches so many other aspects of what's wounding our country socially. Creating economic opportunity in this space gives us an opportunity to begin some of that healing. And then we can take the lessons learned here and move them to other aspects of society. But of course, first we have to learn those lessons here. So what have we know so far? Well, what we know so far is that it's a big, huge problem, that we know that the people who have been affected, negatively impacted, have not been able to profit from the peace. We know that by and large, because of state policies that may have been well-intentioned, we don't have a lot of data to support that what we know. And because we don't have the data to support what we don't know how to fix it. So I'm going to allow the folks on this panel here to introduce themselves, because we're going to have a meaningful conversation about what the problems are, because this is a data point that we have to hear today. And then we can start talking about some meaningful solutions about how to help. So I'll let all the panel members quickly introduce themselves, and we'll start with questions.
You start first?
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Greg Miner. I'm with the City of Oakland. I've been with the City Administrator's Office there since 2014, where I've overseen the permitting of cannabis businesses in the City of Oakland.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Denver. My name is Campo. I'm from Brazil. I've been living in the U.S. for the past 4 years. I have a law degree at University of Rio de Janeiro. Since the very beginning of my career, I started working with drug policy and social justice issues. I'm currently at the Office of Marijuana Policy here at the City of Denver, and I've been coordinating the work around cannabis equity for the past 12 months.
Good afternoon. My name is Kat Packer. I'm the Executive Director of the Department of Cannabis Regulation for the City of Los Angeles. I've been serving in this role since the summer of 2017, and our office is specifically responsible for advising and administering the city's cannabis commercial programs, to include our social equity program.
Hello, I'm Brandon Goldner, and I supervise the City of Portland's cannabis program, and I've been with them since 2015, have been supervising since 2017, and our office also has a three-pronged social equity effort that includes public involvement, licensing, and some competitive grants I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later.
Thank you, everyone. So one of the as we haven't discussed, this issue has been put, unfortunately, on the back burner, been playing second fiddle for way too long. In Colorado, this past legislative session, I had the honor of working on, with many people, some included in this room, on a piece of legislation that, as a accelerator program, we're trying to address some of the, on the one hand, the economic challenges, the barriers to access capital that keep people out of the industry, has created a barrier to entry, as well as, on the other hand, the licensing framework, the regulatory framework, in terms of what people's backgrounds could be, what they have done in their past, and how we can, instead of having someone have a scarlet letter on their back, instead how to turn their history into an opportunity to make their future a better place. So Colorado, we're in the beginning of that process now, and so I would like to hear from those of you who are in jurisdiction who have done some work. What have you done? What has your experience been? What can we learn from that experience? Particularly, what have you done that's worked so we can copy and paste it? So definitely send us a language when you're done, and of course, what pitfalls to avoid. And I'll just, a question to everyone, so I'll just let you all choose how you want to go first.
Do you want me to jump in? Okay, sure. So the city of Oakland had been regulating the retail side of the medical cannabis industry since 2004, but because of a lack of clarity and lack of clear state law in California, even though we legalized medical cannabis back in 1996, because of the lack of state law and threats of federal intervention, we weren't able to legalize the supply chain. So obviously, the plants that and the other products that are being sold at our dispensaries were being produced somewhere, but we weren't able to regulate that. So around 2015, in anticipation of changes in state law to legalize the supply chain and adult use of cannabis, the city of Oakland we were looking at models in Colorado and Washington, and essentially we were gonna do our own copy and pasting, and we were just gonna legalize the status quo essentially. But then an elected official, a former council member, Desley Brooks, began asking questions along the lines of, who is it that actually benefits from legalization? And when we looked at the city of Oakland and our 8 permitted dispensaries, only one of our 8 dispensaries was owned by an African American. And when we looked at other states, it appeared that end of the day, the ones actually getting permits were essentially white males. And so that led to the adoption of our first equity ordinance in 2016 that essentially said half of all permits have to go to equity-owned businesses that were defined as the businesses owned by people from police beats that had disproportionately high levels of cannabis enforcement. But that ordinance, as soon as it was passed, there was a race from one camp to undermine it, and from the other sort of dig deeper. And in my view, part of the problem was that we sort of jumped to solutions, and we didn't have an underlying analysis. So those that were in a position of privilege and had been benefiting from the status quo, who saw that privilege potentially eroding, they immediately wanted to sort of water down the proposal, and were in the ears of our half of our council members. And so there was so they wanted things along the lines of, okay, let's use some of that tax revenue for a no interest or a loan program. But in our view, that was a loan program at some point down the road wasn't going to be enough. So a bunch of different counter proposals went back and forth, and then our city council, we had a newly created Department of Race and Equity that consisted of one person, my colleague Darlene Flynn from the city of Seattle. And her first assignment, our council directed her to work with me and do an equity analysis of our cannabis industry. And in my view, that's really what helped us be successful, and that's my one biggest piece of advice I would have for any jurisdiction, because it did a couple things. First off, it got our council to agree on a goal, which sounds really simple and stupid, but it's essential, because we could then hold them accountable to that goal, as opposed to the prior legislation where it just sort of skipped to some solutions. We could point back to that goal when we ended up having recommendations, say, well, if you want this outcome, this is why we were recommending this proposal. It also laid out relevant data. So we looked at 20 years of law enforcement data that showed that African Americans and Latinos were wildly disproportionately burdened by cannabis arrests in the city of Oakland as compared to our population. It looked at demographic data, poverty data, and then basically said, okay, so now we have that goal. What are the barriers to achieving that goal? And then we laid out, well, what are some of the solutions to eliminate or mitigate those barriers? And so from there, our recommendations kind of flowed. So in terms of barriers, some of them you could probably think of off the top of your head. Access to capital. As long as we're in capitalism, capital is going to be pretty helpful. And I think some folks are like, yeah, okay, well, that applies to any business. And that is true. But in the cannabis industry, because of federal prohibition, you can't get a bank loan. And so one of our biggest dispensaries, the story is that they got their start because they got their mom and dad to take out a second mortgage to help them get started. And then now they're this very large entity. So I sort of alluded to it before, but the uneven playing field. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the terrible statistics and the war on drugs and what I was alluding to a moment before of African Americans being arrested at much higher rates. The irony was in the city of Oakland, and maybe also in other jurisdictions that like to look at themselves as being progressive, we were being pro-cannabis during that period of time when we had, and I apologize for going a little long here. And so by being pro-cannabis, we looked the other way while one side of the industry got to move further and further ahead. So that was a barrier that we identified early on. Access to real estate. Just like any business, it's expensive to rent out or purchase a facility, especially if there's going to be competition in specific zones. Additional barriers were fees, application and permitting fees that we imposed. And then red tape. You know, there's a lot of bureaucracy starting any business, but in the cannabis, we're a huge room full of people trying to figure out what the rules are, and we are, for the most part, making the rules as regulators. So imagine if you're a business person and you've been focused on the cannabis industry, navigating regulatory issues on the local and state level is going to be a burden. So in terms of strategies, right off the gate, we said, okay, we cannot just open the floodgates for permitting. We need to restrict the permitting initially. If we just open it up as is, those that have the head start are going to maintain that, or it's going to be exacerbated. So we said until we decided we're going to reinvest $3.4 million in new cannabis tax revenue in a revolving loan program and a technical assistance program to deal with the red tape. But until that's in place, half of all permits need to go to businesses that are equity owned. And the definition of an equity owned business is a business that's 50% or more controlled by someone that either has a cannabis conviction arising out of Oakland or has lived in police beats for 10 of the last 20 years at disproportionately high levels of cannabis arrests. They also have to be a current Oakland resident and make no more than 80% of the average median income. And then we also created a separate category that was lacking in our 2016 ordinance, which was if you don't qualify as an equity-owned business, but you're willing to provide 3 years of free space and security to that equity business, we refer to you as an incubator, and you get your permitting prioritized. So our original equity program ordinance basically was going to require people who had two separate businesses to merge in sort of an arranged marriage format, whereas this kind of allowed for people with their own business to keep it separate. Essentially, we tried to take the self-interest of the cannabis industry who wanted to get permitted, and we just tried to align it with our equity goals. And so that analysis dramatically changed the conversation. It essentially shut a lot of people up because it was easy kind of in the back of your mind, yeah, I know the war on drugs is bad, it's bad, and we'll give some of that tax revenue later down the road, but when you really laid out the case, it really changed the conversation. It doesn't mean 100% of the people were on board, but we got it passed through council in 2017. We've been receiving permit applications ever since for the full supply chain. We've added 8 new dispensaries in a separate permitting process where we again, as for staff, it was helpful. I looked back to what was the goal that we adopted, and I'm sorry for rambling, I'm almost done here. We look back to that goal, and so one of the main strategies there, we said you don't have to have a property as a prerequisite to qualifying for a dispensary permit. And you know what? We're not going to do that. We're not going to score equity applications because scoring tends to invite subjectivity. Who can afford to have an attorney or consultant to fill this out? So once people met minimum criteria, they're eligible for a public drawing. And so in the last round we had. And then once they were selected, then capital is essentially attracted to them. They had it was much easier to find a location at that point. And so I want to say of the additional 8 new dispensaries, half are owned or co-owned by African Americans. 6 of the 8 are owned by people of color. So as compared to where we started from, we've definitely made progress. There's a lot more work to do, and I think we'll get into that a little later.
Thanks. Hey, I saw, Brandon, I saw you scratching me furiously there. So, but before you answer, I wanted to hear a little bit from Kat and Bia because I actually think there's a question I had for you specifically, Brandon, that I think maybe to address this and then dovetail into. So of Kat and Bia, if you have anything you'd like to add on this particular question.
Yes. So let me tell you guys a little bit about Denver's story when it comes to cannabis equity. So I think in the city of Denver, we always look through everything that we do through an equity and social justice lens, being cannabis, being capital improvements in the city, jobs, constructions. So from the get-go in 2014, we've always set aside a pretty big chunk of our cannabis revenue to programs that represented underserved parts of the city. A couple examples of those are our educational programs. We had about $10 million invested in after-school and summer programs that happen in disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs neighborhoods in the city of Denver. We also, just this year, put $9 million for affordable housing. So we always had this like holistic 360 view of equity. But then in 2018, and I think the folks that spoke on the panel before were talking a little bit about that. Representative Singer talked a little bit about that. This is a new conversation that changed the focus a little bit in 2017, 2018, and it became about cannabis equity, meaning equity in the industry. So in 2018, in July 2018, the mayor went to see our mayor, and somebody asked him this question. So when he came back, he gave the Office of Marijuana Policy, and he asked us, how can we make our industry more equitable? We do not have the data. We are currently looking into that data, but anecdotally, we know that it's majority white males. So how can we make this industry more equitable, and how do we lower the barriers for people that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs? So the first thing we did was we created this work group, for a government work group that has human rights and community partnerships, our Office of Economic Development, our city attorneys, our licensing department, and we created what we call our three-pronged approach. Our three-pronged approach is convictions, workforce development, and licensure ownership. The first thing that we decided to tackle was the convictions piece. Back then, I remember there was a lot of news about New York and Illinois, how they were automatically expunging records. So we were like, oh, this is going to be so easy, right? We're going to press a button, the records are going to go away, yay, victory us. That's not the truth. In reality, what we learned very quickly was that for a number of reasons, state law being one of them, we had to do a case-by-case basis, which meant that we would need to reach out to those people, get them out the door, and then expunge those convictions. We created the free turnover new leaf program. It's a program that is still going on. We did some clinics around the city, and we had about 400 people that applied for this program. And then now we are on the second phase, which is the workforce development and licensure ownership. We hired a firm to do a survey analysis and some data analysis on our demographics in the city, as well as our market, a cannabis market. We want to make sure that if we're bringing people who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs into this fold, we're putting them in an industry that is going to continue to grow. And throughout all of this process, we were so lucky because we had so many partners. We partnered with the Denver District Attorney. We partnered with a lot of community activists, social justice activists. So it's just been a very collaborative effort. And I think Denver is in the right path to create a dent in cannabis social equity.
So I'm very appreciative that the Denver Marijuana Management Symposium is hosting this particular lunch panel, because I think that it's super imperative for folks who are responsible for marijuana management to be engaging and leading these conversations, because equity is not a conversation, it's truly the conversation that needs to be happening. Thank you. And part of it is everything that we're talking about today should be looked at in a lens of equity. So if we're talking about law enforcement and policing, we should be trying to figure out how to do that equitably. If we're talking about health and public safety, that's something that we should be talking about trying to do equitably. And as most of us, our primary responsibility is issuing licenses as they relate to commercial cannabis activity, that's just a natural progression of this conversation around equity. So I think that part of the challenge is that equity can be a difficult term to define, but really my offer to folks here today is to try not to put equity in a small box, but to think of it much more large in the context of what our respective responsibilities are. The city of Oakland was the first city in the nation to pass an equity program, and I remember it being late 2017 and us trying to figure out what the city of Los Angeles was going to do in order to participate in this conversation. It was critically important for the city of Los Angeles to be able to not only participate, but in part to lead this conversation, because we know that there are parts of the city of Los Angeles that have really been ground zero for the war on drugs. And there are community members by the tens of thousands who have experienced cannabis arrests, and these arrests meant that they weren't able to participate in housing, education, employment, all of these collateral consequences. And now we have this industry for doing much of the same thing. And the truth of the matter is that most of the arrests that these community members were experiencing were just for possession, not these large commercial empires that we are responsible for standing up. And so similar to the city of Oakland, we largely modeled our program, or at least the development of our program, off of Oakland. And at the time, it was San Francisco and Oakland and Sacramento and the city of Los Angeles really trying to figure out together. I was on the phone with my counterparts in those jurisdictions, sometimes on a weekly basis, just checking in to figure out how this particular conversation would mature. But similarly, we conducted a social equity analysis that allowed us to determine a framework for what our eligibility criteria would be for the program. And that criteria is as follows. Largely, folks are able to participate in the City of LA's social equity program if they are low income, if they are have lived in a disproportionately impacted area, or if they themselves have had past cannabis arrests or convictions. And again, the centerpiece around this program is making sure that folks who meet that criteria have an ownership stake in the business. So we do have a tiered model in which there are a number of ways that folks can participate, either at an ownership level of 51% or greater, or 33 1/3% or greater, not to get caught up in the kind of details of the minutia. But part of what I think I'd offer to folks who are starting to do this is that it does take a lot of intentional conversations early on. It's difficult to have conversations about equity and licensing if there isn't access to licensing. And so it can be difficult to have that conversation retroactively if that access has been taken up by non-equity participants. And so part of what we've tried to do is to have a phased approach. And in full transparency, our ordinance required us to prioritize non-equity applicants. The city of Los Angeles, like the state of California, just started its regulatory program in 2018. And while the state of California allowed for local jurisdictions to set their own regulatory frameworks prior to legalization, the city of Los Angeles had no type of infrastructure, even for its medical cannabis operators. And so in 2018, the city of Los Angeles started to authorize medical businesses for the first time. And we had to spend all of 2018 and the greater part of 2019 just transitioning our existing market. That was very frustrating for many social equity stakeholders because they were watching this existing medical market be given attention by the Department of Cannabis Regulation and try to set up this infrastructure. And although we passed our social equity program into law back in December of 2017, it's really right now in September of 2019 that we're really starting to get our programming off the ground. And so I think in hindsight would have been helpful to tell folks is just up front how long it was going to take. Of course, we didn't know how long that transition was going to take, but absent us being able to provide that information, we know that there are certain implications. We had folks who saw the eligibility criteria established and ran out and got properties. And then unfortunately, many of those folks had to sit on those properties for almost a year and a half. And of course, you can imagine trying to pay rent for properties that you can't put to good operational use. And so I think that even just having that hindsight or knowing that up front and being able to communicate, we're not actually going to be able to start social equity licensing for a year and a half, so everybody can stay calm in their seats. The other issue that's critically important, we passed our program back in 2017, but it took us almost 18 to 20 months to get any resources dedicated to the program. And so we had a program and policy on the books, but no budget dedicated to the program itself. And it's one thing to have a program on paper, a completely different conversation to actually have resources for that program. And so it's great that the state of California has a grant program that we are very excited about the release of grant funding, and fortunately we were able to secure local funding as well. But the truth of the matter is that our programs are just beginning, they're just starting, and a cautionary tale to try and, one, be as proactive as possible with communicating with the social equity community, and then also making sure that you secure resources up front, because even once you get those resources, it's going to take time to put those resources to work.
So, Brandon, before you answer, I want to frame your response a little bit more, because I mean, Greg and Kat specifically brought up this issue of, and Kat said it precisely, hit it exactly on the head. You can't talk about equity in issuing licenses if there's no licenses to be issued, right? So if you'll forgive a oversimplification of history to make a bad analogy about a complex problem, but when you think about why was France so easy to take over in World War II, is because all of their men were dead from World War I, right? So there's no one to defend them. So when you make that analogy about communities, well, if everybody that was supposed to be making the businesses 20 years ago in a community, everyone that was supposed to be working and providing for the family in community 20 years ago was in jail, well, from an economic perspective, dead and jail are exactly the same, which is that you're not there, right? So that's why these communities are struggling for so long, because they didn't have the economic infrastructure 20 years ago. So now it's about not just how do you catch up today, but how do you undo the damage of, in some instances, for some of these communities, decades of having the economic engine, their males, arrested out of their communities, and how do you address that? So to that end, Brandon, I wanted to sort of add the friends of what is there in fact some sort of governmental imperative to do something about this? How do we address this incredibly complex problem? Because again, if no one in my community has an education, if no one in my community has owned a business before, if my parents are in jail, how do I then do all the things that are expected of me in this highly complex, regulated industry? For maybe one of the questions is the level of complexity and regulation even necessary for this industry, or are we setting people up for failure? So again, is there some sort of government imperative to address this issue in a meaningful way for these communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I appreciate you teeing it up that way, because I did want to start with the way I view this work. There needs to be a shared understanding of American history, the racist legacy of the war on drugs, both in intent and outcome, from law enforcement to political figures to staff members, people who maybe were sitting in seats very similar to mine, to the judicial system, all the way down the line. There is a legacy of racism which we need to acknowledge and talk about, and be comfortable doing so. That is really, really important. So yeah, there is an imperative, and it goes beyond just the licensing. I can say with the efforts Portland has made, first, I wish that we would have put some of this structure into place a lot sooner. We developed a licensing and regulation platform in 2015 before there were a lot of case studies on how legal cannabis would work, what the impacts may be. And frankly, a lot of the decision-making was driven by that lack of information and fear. And because of that, some of these more important conversations about how do we address the historical legacy that this government has been perpetuating, those were not a part of those conversations as much as they should have been. And so Portland had a late start. What we're doing today, since late 2018, I mentioned a three-pronged approach, and Bia, I will have to arm wrestle you over using that term three-pronged. The licensing piece, the public advisory piece, and the competitive grants piece. So really briefly, Portland, in our cannabis licensing, if you're a social equity applicant, you get a license credit discount. Right now, that's defined as folks, owners or staff who have a cannabis conviction, or businesses who work with Oregon's minority-owned, women-owned, and emerging small business vendor list, and those who may be a small business. So if you fall into those categories, you get a license credit discount. And beyond that, the ability to access this regulation, we also allow folks to defer their license payment for a while. And we also give a credit for folks who take advantage of early assistance meetings on the building permitting side, because when you look at cannabis regulations, these businesses are really stress testing other municipal and state regulations like building permits that can be extremely expensive, and so trying to provide some relief for that was the licensing piece of it. On the competitive grants, Portland has a 3% local tax on cannabis sales, and a portion of that goes to a competitive grants process that funds organizations that help with record clearing and expungement, helps with workforce development, not just for the cannabis industry, but skills like highway flagging skills and construction skills, and also funds small business improvements directly, as well as reentry housing. So it's a competitive grants piece. And then finally, and this is really important, the public advisory piece of it, earlier this year, we convened what we call the Cannabis Policy Oversight Team, or CPOT. It's a local public advisory body for cannabis policies, but specifically to recommend equitable outcomes in that policy. They are just beginning to present their recommendations right about now. The reason why that's important is when any of us, we talk about licensing, we talk about grants, we talk about who are we trying to benefit and who we're not, what data we have available, what policies should be changed. Who are the people making those decisions and prioritizing those conversations? And that's why I think it's super important to have an advisory body piece that may be separate from your elected lawmakers, from your staff, to get a better perspective on all of these things. So yes, there is a government imperative for sure.
Thanks. So I want to, we've talked about how this problem has been delayed, and of course anybody who speaks Spanish does not need a degree in economics to understand, if they know the word chicle, to understand that first market advantage is substantial advantage, and that ship has now sailed. So I guess I'll start with Bia and kind of go around a little bit, since Bia, we have the most mature market. When you think about, particularly as I guess we all know, or I shouldn't assume, but we all probably do know that historically the ways to touch this plant commercially have been you either grow it, you either sell it, or you manufacture something with it. Now, in Colorado as well as other states, there are other aspects now: hospitality, tourism, delivery, other components are coming into place. So since it's too late to be the chicle of dispensaries, I had to switch languages. Too late to be chicle of dispensaries. Is it reasonable to think that there, and I guess actually Randy actually also mentioned in terms of workforce development outside of the cannabis industry using some of these resources. So what opportunities are there do exist now moving forward, looking forward, for folks to enter the space, whether touching the plant directly or indirectly, in ways that are actually going to create meaningful generational wealth for the communities in which they live?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to cannabis equity, we share similar challenges, and then we have different challenges that are unique to our jurisdictions, right? I think the similar challenges have somewhat been touched in here: lack of banking. So for instance, we have a minority-owned business loan in the city of Denver, but the minority business loan fund comes from federal grants. So that means that they can't go to cannabis businesses. The fact there is no banking, that might change real soon, but at this point in time, somebody can't go to a bank and get a loan to open a cannabis business. It's a highly regulated market and highly compliance driven, which usually means more lawyers, more accountants, more staff, which rises the price of cannabis businesses. And I think on top of all of that, there is the fact that the gap created by the war on drugs intensified those challenges for those communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. So I think we all were gonna, when you guys are creating equity programs in your jurisdictions, you're gonna be faced with those problems. And then Denver, I think, has its unique set of issues that we have to navigate through. I think the first and foremost is the fact that our Amendment 64, our framework for legalization in our state, did not bring an equity component. And it also didn't bring sustainability issues. It also didn't bring social consumption. But I think equity was something that when I was preparing to speak here today, I was looking through the notes for the Amendment 64 work groups, and equity wasn't one of the components. I think we were trying to, we were the first one in the world. We were trying to get it off the ground. Our priorities were around safety, health, youth prevention. So I think now we have, I think the mayor said in his welcome message, we're looking at those issues like sustainability, cannabis equity, social consumption as Cannabis 2.0 policy. So, I think at that point in time, in 2012, we unintendedly created some barriers that are now still in place. So it's a matter of how do we deconstruct those barriers. A couple examples is vertical integration, the fact that somebody needs to own a dispensary, a manufacturing infused product, and a grow increases a lot their cost and increases the cost of entering in this industry. And on top of all of that, I think we have to acknowledge that the conversation about race and social justice has changed dramatically, and it's not the same that it was in 2012. It's not even the same that it was in 2016. So how do we, in this new political arena that we're living in, how do we frame the questions that we are asking? Greg, last year in this same panel, he said, we are the results of the questions that we asked. So the questions that we're asking now are different from the questions that we were asking in 2012. So it's about how do we evolve and how do we make better policy concerning cannabis equity. I think on top of all of that, there's the fact that in Denver, we have a very solidified market. We've been up and running for 6 years, so we are walking towards a more oligopoly style. We have bigger companies that are buying smaller companies. We have smaller companies that are going out of business. So we have about 1,146 active licenses in the city of Denver out of 490-something locations. So. And we have a cap in place, which basically means that nobody can come in at this point in time and get a dispensary or a grow license in Denver. So all of those factors make it really hard for us to navigate how we establish a equity program that will allow people who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs to enter this industry. However, with all of that being said, I think we do have a bright future ahead. I think as Sean mentioned, we had 3 pieces of legislation that just passed at the state level. The first one is delivery, self-explanatory, delivery of marijuana. The second one is hospitality, which is basically social consumption, clubs, cafes for consumption of cannabis, and the accelerator, which will allow for somebody to get an accelerator license and work out of somebody else's manufacturing infused product facility. So that would reduce the costs of entrance as well. So I think there's a arduous path ahead for us for sure, but I think, and honestly, what's been great is for the first time ever, we're not the guinea pigs. So we have Oakland to look up to, we have LA to look up to, San Francisco, and I think we have this interjurisdiction cannabis call that we have with each other. So it's been great learning like what they got wrong, what they got right, and how we can make it all work for Denver.
Does anyone else want to add to that, just about this general concept of new license opportunities, new market opportunities? How does a new market entrant make meaningful inroads into established and saturated markets in a way that's meaningful?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I mentioned previously that the city of Los Angeles has had to focus on transitioning our existing market, but because our market is so large, for example, we have about 187 existing medical retail facilities that were allowed to participate in adult use, but the city of Los Angeles framework will allow for upwards of 400 retail facilities in the city, and the way that we've structured our licensing regime, somewhat similar to Oakland, is that the city council ordinances say that we have to process social equity applications on a 2-to-1 ratio to non-equity applications. And so what that means, we can round it up to 200, because we've already issued 200 non-equity applications. The Department of Cannabis Regulation is required by law to process 400 social equity applications before we ever get back to an equity applicant. Now, you can imagine that caused some frustration for non-equity participants, but the reality is that people shouldn't be approaching this as if they are entitled to participate in this market. I think that there is real first mover advantage, and we've tried to structure mechanisms for our equity applicants to be first to market. I think part of what is going to be challenging for us, even for folks who have this first mover advantage, thinking long term, is how do we ensure that the social equity applicants that were first to move aren't the first to be kicked out once some of these larger corporations come in. And the truth of the matter is, and you've heard it around the table, we have to acknowledge that the racism and injustice that existed and that exists was both intentional and not intentional. And so we have to be very intentional with our ability to address that. And so in order for us to do so, I appreciate the approach that Denver is taking, because we can't assume that it's too far gone to have the conversation. I think that there's always going to be an opportunity for us to figure out how we make our policies more equitable. And it's something as simple as everybody's excited about banking and the prospect of individuals being able to bank. But if you know how banking inequities exist, the industry could have access to banking, and those same communities, low-income and minority communities, could be kept out of banking opportunities. And so unless we're being very intentional in saying, how do we create equitable banking, not just banking, we will continue to allow disparities to exist. But again, we're working very collaboratively with one another nowadays and trying to figure out how we move this conversation forward. And the conversation is going to look different for every single jurisdiction. But I think that there's a huge opportunity that exists in us sharing best practices and strategies. And I don't know that we can look at any particular model and say, let's do that. I don't want anyone to look at what the city of Los Angeles is doing and say, let's do that. And I truly mean it. I think that there are models that exist, and these models are ripe for constructive criticism. I don't think that anybody should be taking the criticism of their regulatory and licensing programs personally. We're personally responsible for managing these programs, but it is going to take a collaborative effort and an intentional effort for us to make sure that this happens equitably, and we only do that by working together and asking those important questions sooner rather than later.
Brandon, I know you wanted to chime in, and we're running short on time, but I wanted to, Kat, you touched this lightly. I'm going to touch it directly, which is to say that we're trying to address a situation that was inherently unfair. It's very unlikely we're going to address that in a situation that someone else is going to determine to be fair. There's going to be some level of unfairness as perceived by others involved in this, and the courage to take that on because we're trying to rebalance a very unbalanced scale. So I just wanted to give you a wide berth because I can say that, but maybe you can't say that quite so directly.
Well, yeah, I mean, and just to that point, and then two quick things about what can a more mature regulatory, jurisdiction do, even though your business base is baked in. Yeah, I mean, again, the structures that we're dealing with here have been tipped in the scale of certain populations for generations and centuries. That's not fair. And so you have to recognize that. And so when you're setting up new policies, just keeping that at the front of your mind is super ultra important. So no doubt. Two quick things. With a mature regulatory framework like Portland has, I mentioned earlier the minority-owned, women-owned, and emerging small business list is a state certification are there ways that your states and your jurisdictions can encourage, electricians, plumbers, people who do point of sale services ancillary to the cannabis industry to provide some benefit for those folks or incentivize the cannabis industry to work with those folks? That's one way you can do it. And then my second point was when new cannabis policies and new ways of engaging with cannabis come online. The example in Oregon is social consumption. Thinking about how you can thread it into your conversations there and your advocacy, the city of Portland has been supportive of a state framework for social consumption for many years. And one thing we tried to bring to the table during the last session was asking the state to be mindful that that framework not just include locations that are licensed for people to consume cannabis and can also sell cannabis and are fully licensed cannabis businesses, but what about folks who own venues, who own spaces or outdoor spaces where they may want to hold a wedding that has cannabis consumption, and to not forget about those folks too. That may have a lower barrier of entry to participate, again, ways in which people can benefit from cannabis being legal without themselves being a licensed cannabis business.
Yeah, I think honestly it comes down to the definition of equity versus equality, right? What we're talking here about is exactly that. How do we create mechanisms to bring those people who have been for centuries and for at least the last decades on the war on drugs impacted? How do we bring them to somewhat of the same playing field level as the people who are making millions of dollars off of this industry? So I think it's about how, as government, we can create opportunities for those people.
How am I doing for time? Okay. Do you want to add something to that? Because I think we actually take some audience questions. I think we have time. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you?
Yeah. I've got everything on my list. Unless it's something you want to add specifically, but I think we have time for a few audience questions.
I guess, I wrote like 3 pieces of advice that I want to give to the folks here today. And those 3 pieces of advice are, the first one, talk to everyone. So make sure you're talking to your lawyers, your economists, with the established industry, if you already have established industry in your jurisdiction, with the people who want to join the industry, with the people who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. Do not create a program without going to the people who are going to be impacted by your program. With your activists and with your fellow regulators, make sure that you learned and research as much as possible about other programs in other cities to see what is the best fit for your city. The second is data collection. This is something that we're having to backtrack here in Denver. Make sure you have the demographic and as well as the workforce data on who are the people who have cannabis businesses or they're looking to have cannabis businesses in their jurisdictions. And third is defining your policy questions and your goals really well. And don't take my word for it, work with your lawyer, but for instance, questions of how do you define an equity applicant? Is it that you want to diversify the industry, or is it that you want to help people who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, or is it that you want to bring minorities into the fold? Those 3 things might look different in your jurisdiction. How are you going to do the distribution of licenses? Kat and Greg touched on it. With their jurisdictions, they separated a chunk of the licenses to equity applicants. Are you going to give 100% for a period of time? Are you going to give 50%, 1/3? What is it going to look like? Is it going to be a lottery? Partnership models. Are you going to have any partnership models? Who are going to be the partners? Is it the established industry? Is it third sector? Is it the government itself? What are the benefits that you're going to give to those equity applicants? Brendan touched on that very well. We cannot assume that they are in the same playing field as a regular applicant, for lack of a better word. So how are you going to set them up for success? And then lastly, just reach out to Denver. We're here to be a resource to you all. And personally, I love talking about the subject. So I'm really, really interested to see how new jurisdictions move into this.
And then Just to add a couple of pieces of advice, and this is going to piggyback off of some of what Bia said. Similarly, the City of Los Angeles and the Department of Cannabis Regulation are very eager to bring other folks into this conversation, and we want to work collaboratively to do so. Again, as you're approaching these different aspects of your various responsibilities, be thinking about disparities that could exist. So whether they're health disparities, disparities in the legal process, disparities in economics, disparities in social life, and part of what we've determined, just kind of have a running list of things that we can tackle to try and address cannabis inequity, as Nicole Elliott had said previously, making sure that you're not only allowing for licensing, but decriminalizing certain cannabis activities are going to be critically important, ensuring that there's a mechanism for resentencing or expungement, patient and consumer access, and making sure that there's actually equity in access to cannabis, reducing licensing barriers, and that kind of starts with making sure that there aren't explicit restrictions for folks who have past cannabis convictions or other types of nonviolent drug-related offenses, beyond ensuring that there is equity in cannabis business ownership, ensuring that there's equity in employment and workforce development, trying to model equitable corporate social responsibility, dedicating tax revenue towards community reinvestment, making sure that we try and close the gap in what could be considered employment or housing discrimination for folks who use cannabis. Because it's great that people can go ahead and buy cannabis, but these communities are going to be the same communities who are likely to be discriminated against in employment and housing for their engagement with cannabis. And then similarly, tracking cannabis-related enforcement and making sure that there aren't disparities that continue in the way that we enforce cannabis laws like DUIs and things like that. So just gave you 10 different ways that folks can try and tackle these things, and these are by no means things that we have perfected in the state of California and the city of Los Angeles, but again, working together, we can do better.
Let's get you quick. I'm not sure which time we have, but he's been waiting for
Yeah,
quite
we
a
only
while,
have time for a few questions, but yeah, we can take a few.
This leads well into some good advice that I think you can give everybody here. So my name is Dimitri Downing. I'm an ex-prosecutor, 10 years, financial crimes, domestic violence, marijuana crimes. 7 years, lobbying industry, expert, Arizona, working in Mexico now. This reminds me a lot of, and I appreciate your noble goals, especially in regards to expungement, et cetera. Licensing. As we've seen with MSOs picking up licenses in states and this limited licensing structure that is being accepted as the proper model, what are the checks and balances, safeguards, follow-ups, accountabilities that you would recommend to jurisdictions looking at social equity in the licensing process? Because there's no shortage of liars in this world. I experienced that as 12 years prosecuting, 7 years in this industry. We've seen MSOs have to give back licenses because they use some random person to create a falsehood. While your noble goals are extremely noble, and I applaud them, I support you in the concepts. Maybe I'm a little bit older than all of you guys, so I lived through affirmative action, and I've seen reverse discrimination and discrimination both ways. I have a brown parent and a white parent. But there's so many members of this industry, the cannabis industry, that will specifically take advantage of that, of these programs that you guys are planning. So if you're going to make recommendations to governments, to regulators, to pursue social equity through licensing, what would you also suggest is the next step to make sure that that actually happens?
This is a perfect question because this is something that we're dealing with constantly and on a daily basis in the city of LA. We're kind of generally referring to these engagements as predatory practices. Folks trying to take advantage of the social equity applicant and their ability to be first to market in our respective jurisdictions. I think one, as the regulators, we have a responsibility to try and provide oversight. There are a number of ways that we could, for example, just put on the books penalties for folks who lie. so that we can revoke or impose penalties, et cetera, if we find out at some point that folks are lying to us about various ownership stakes in the business. I think that, part of, you mentioned the multi-state operators. I think that if there are mechanisms that allow for, if we identify an owner is doing shady stuff in one jurisdiction, for jurisdictions to be able to communicate information with one another. And I don't know that that's happening as regularly as it should. Regulators from other states communicating and saying this person was a bad actor, they did XYZ violation in California, now they're trying to do the same thing in Denver. How would we know that if we're not sharing that information? But I think that, for example, in the city of Los Angeles, we'd love it if we could create a mechanism where we're in direct communication with the state about what the ownership stake is supposed to be. And then that way, if they're sharing information with us, that information should be uniform with what they're sharing with the state. We have multiple eyes on the application to make sure that folks aren't lying to us. But I think that part of what we've learned in our process thus far, and this is critically important. It's so important for us to have the programming first before licenses become available, because many of the social equity applicants may not even know, people were going around finding people who met this criteria and then saying, sign this paper, sign this non-disclosure agreement, right? And so we needed to be able to get to them first, and as it's been mentioned over and over again, government can be slow to respond and the industry is much more innovative. And so I think having mechanisms, one, for folks to report violations or things that are considered predatory practices, and then regulators working collaboratively to put additional eyes and scrutiny and penalties on these operators when they are in violation are going to be key. But if anybody else has more recommendations on how we fix that, this is a live issue in our jurisdiction.
Just to follow up on that, a couple of thoughts. One of the recommendations in our equity analysis was to minimize subjective language in our ordinance to the extent possible. Language is inherently imperfect. It's a reflection of human beings are imperfect. But to the extent possible, you can have objective criteria. It's going to be easier to hold people accountable and to achieve your intent that was codified in language. Secondarily, offering free legal assistance to equity applicants is one strategy that we're as part of our technical assistance program, because they're facing all sorts of issues, whether that any business might encounter with landlord, tenant, or just negotiating contracts with people that may not have the best intention in mind. So those are two strategies. The third would be to constantly assess and evaluate, are we achieving the goals that we tried? So for example, we're going to open up another round of dispensary permitting, and we're going to build off, okay, what worked well last time, what didn't? Because I don't know if I've given it away, our program isn't perfect, and your program may not be perfect too. So that's why it's important to constantly reassess and to make sure, are we achieving those goals? Because you're right, you can have something on paper that looks perfect, but making it a reality, which may never be perfect, but you can always improve it, I think, if you're constantly evaluating whether you're actually achieving those goals.
Hey, we actually are unfortunately running short on time. We do need to allow time for the hotel staff to clear out this room for plates. But we'll be back in this room at 1:45. I'd like to thank this panel. If we could give them a round of applause.